Okay, hello. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am Tisa Wack, a member of Everytown Survivor Network and Deputy Chapter Lead for South Carolina Chapter of Moms Demand Action, and I'll be moderating today's call. Today marks 5 years since the shooting in Charleston, during which a white supremacist murdered 9 Black Americans while they prayed at Mother Emanuel. We have brought this group together today for a few reasons. First and foremost, we are here to honor those we lost 5 years ago. Ethel Lee Lance, Susie Jackson, Tywanda Sanders, Myra Thompson, Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Cynthia Hurd, Reverend Daniel L. Simmons, Reverend DePayne Middleton Doctor, and Reverend Clemente Pinckney. Before we proceed, I would like for us to take a moment of silence to honor those lost. Thank you so much for taking that moment of reflection with me. We will also be discussing the loophole that the shooter used to purchase his guns, now known as the Charleston Loophole. And finally, we will be focused on how the racism that drove the Charleston shooter still plagues our country every day. Joining us today, we have House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn, the author of H.R. 1112, the House passed bill to address the Charleston Loophole. Representative Joe Cunningham, who is a co-sponsor of H.R. 1112. Reverend Eric Manning, who is the Reverend at Mother Emanuel Church. And State Representative Marvin Pendarvis, who represents Charleston in the South Carolina House of Representatives. The way this town hall is going to work is that each of our speakers are going to give brief remarks, and then I have a few questions for them, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Before we get started, I just want to thank you again to all of our amazing speakers today and to everyone who took the time out of their day to join us this afternoon. As a South Carolinian and a mother who lost her son and only child, Tyrell, to gun violence, I know firsthand the pain and suffering that our community felt and still feels as a result of this shooting. Today's amazing turnout is evidence of the strength of our community, and this panel is evidence of the strength of our leaders. With that, I'll hand it over to our first speaker, Whip Clyburn.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wack, and let me thank all of those who participated today. I especially want to thank Joe Cunningham for his representation and for his friendship and for his co-sponsorship of this very, very important piece of legislation. And thank you, Marvin, for your longtime friendship as well, and the leadership that you continue to give to the people of South Carolina and of North Charleston. And Reverend Manning, your friendship is valued, and I really, really enjoy the interactions we have in your profession, and of course, as my chosen affiliation, Morris Brown AME Church. I want to say a couple of things, and hopefully not take too long to do so. There's something interesting about this entire event. I have said that it came on the heels 2 months after a very egregious act, a police officer shooting one of my constituents, Walter Scott, in the back as he ran away. It may have been the first instance that the country got to see such an event as it occurred. An innocent bystander walking on his way to work in a barbershop saw what was happening recorded it. And that's how we knew what really happened.
Mhm.
Then, of course, 2 months later, you saw this event take place in the basement of Mother Emanuel. 9 souls worshiping in their religious calling, had their lives snuffed out by a self-professed white supremacist. The interesting thing about this, and I've been reflecting on this a lot lately, is that after the Walter Scott event, I shared the pulpit at Emmanuel with Reverend Pinckney in one of the protests about that shooting. That to me was something a bit interesting. I knew Reverend Pinckney from our long relationship when he was a student at Allen University. He interned in my office. And of course, we got to know each other very, very well. So what's important about this? I think that the North Charleston reaction to the Walter Scott shooting and the Charleston reaction to this egregious crime demonstrated to the country the way they go about seeking justice. The mayor of North Charleston, a Republican, joined with the protesters. He fired the perpetrator. We all saw him tried, found guilty, and he's spending 20 years. Then we saw a Democratic mayor of Charleston join with the protesters. And we saw the arrest in 2 days of the perpetrator. The community responded. The mayor joined the community. And we saw the families and friends of the victims come together in solemnity and offered forgiveness. The perpetrator is now sitting on death row. I think that ushered in that a 5-year period, which now holds out as a tremendous example of how we react to such catastrophic events. I sincerely believe that what we're seeing now in reaction to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the most recent event in Atlanta, I'm convinced that this country is reacting the way it is because North Charleston and Charleston reacted the way they did. We have ushered in a tremendous movement that I believe, if not allowed to be hijacked, we are going to see significant and lasting change in the way we conduct ourselves and the way we react to each other. We can pass this legislation to close the Charleston Loophole. It's not the same thing as what we're doing today, dealing with policing. But if we create the right climate and people see in our actions and reactions that we genuinely or about solving problems, about making headway rather than headlines, about moving our country peacefully toward a more perfect union. I'm convinced that what we celebrate today is actually the beginning of what will make this country a better country for all of us and those who will come after us. Thank you for letting me be a part of it.
Thank you so much, Whip Clyburn. Now we are going to pass it on to Representative Joe Cunningham.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tisa, and thank you, Mr. Whip, for those comments and for your friendship and everything that you do for South Carolinians. Always a pleasure to see my friend Representative Pendarvis here. Reverend Manning, pleasure to be here with you as well. I feel like I'm in great company. I think about when just a few years ago when I was practicing law downtown Charleston before running for Congress, how every day on my way to work, I would drive down Calhoun Street and I'd pass by Mother Emanuel. And so every single day there was a constant reminder of the tragedy that occurred there 5 years ago today when we lost 9 precious lives to violence and racism and hatred. And it was a constant reminder that something must be done to prevent a similar event from happening again. And you think back to the words of Martin Luther King Jr. when he said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I feel like he meant those words as a call to action, that he wasn't suggesting that justice and progress are inevitable. Indeed, it's clear that from the events of recent weeks that progress in this country comes in fits and starts, and the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, but only when and only because we pull it towards justice with our deeds and with our actions. And we still have a long ways to go. But I'm heartened by the individuals in our community, many of whom are gathered virtually together today, who are demanding action on gun violence and demanding action on police brutality and demanding action on systemic racism. Progress in this country has always been an active struggle. My friend Whip Clyburn can speak to that more so than most. And when a horrific act of violence and white supremacy rocked our city 5 years ago today, we came together as Charlestonians and demanded accountability while expressing a level of compassion that is fitting of the holy city. I'll never forget the family members of the victims and how they reacted during the bond hearing of that racist monster, and how they offered compassion and forgiveness. It's something I'm not sure I would be able to do, but it shows a strength and a love that should be echoed across this country, and especially in times of tragedy. But what we need now is to act. And as we deliberate, unarmed Black men and women continue to be killed in this country. COVID-19 disproportionately impacts Black Americans and other communities of color. And as we've learned, COVID-19 has made the Charleston Loophole even deadlier by causing a surge in gun sales that has put an even more massive strain on the background check system and increased the risk that individuals like Dylan Roof will slip through the cracks. It's a privilege to help lead the Low Country during this moment, and I promise you I will not let you down. I'd urge the Senate to pass H.R. 1112 and close the Charleston Loophole once and for all. In the meantime, I'm going to continue working with my colleagues in the House and the Senate to pass bipartisan legislation that provides swift and transformative legislation to address police brutality and systemic racism. I want to again thank my fellow panelists, Whip Clyburn, Reverend Manning, Representative Pendarvis, for joining me here today for this important conversation. And I thank everyone else for joining virtually in this audience, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Representative Cunningham. Now we pass it on to Reverend Eric Manning.
Well, thank you, Tisha, for the opportunity as well. I'm humbled and honored to be a part of such a wonderful, esteemed panel. I thank God for what both congressmen have been doing. I remember it was about a year ago, a little bit over a year, when they came to Mother Emanuel to discuss HR 1112. Of course, it passed in the House, and it has sat there in the Senate. I will be very candid and direct, of course, on this day that we remember, in which 9 members of Mother Emanuel were brutally murdered by white supremacists. Later, of course, to come to find out that he was only able to procure those weapons, or that weapon, just by virtue of waiting the period. But then there was, of course, also waiting for the background check to come in, and the leadership of Congressman Clyburn to change or close what has become known as the Charleston Loophole. I am saddened that the state senators from this state have not rallied around to stand and say, let's have a vote to pressure the majority leader in the Senate, at least to have an up-down vote, so that way we could record where they stand. It is a travesty of justice when we fail to have the courage that is needed to take a stand from a biblical perspective, because what we do for the least of these. And it is time not to just continue to have empty words, but to have the action that goes along with those words that you have promised. So I'm encouraged, even though I know the road has been long. I am reminded of the long struggle that I've heard Congressman Clyburn say before, how long he's been on the battlefield fighting. And there is still much work that needs to be done. We must continue to be mindful about sensible gun legislation, sensible gun reform. It's not to take away anyone's weapon, but it is to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to procure a weapon legally. And all we're suggesting is just waiting a little while longer. We wait to learn how to drive. We wait to learn how to drink. We wait to even open up a bank account. We wait to purchase a car. We wait to purchase a house. Nowhere in God's green earth can we ever find anything being instantaneous any longer. We must understand that, again, this is not to take away anyone's right. This is not a violation of anyone's right. Realistically, it's making sure that we are protecting the least of these, those who, of course, are innocent, those who, of course, who have a right to live, those who, of course, understand the importance of the sanctity of life. So, once again, on this day that we remember what took place in this basement. If I open up my side door, I can look to the place where several of the church members and leadership were murdered that night. And we must not let their dying be in vain. So I encourage those who are able to contact their senators, whatever state they are in, and just ask them, let's vote. Let's take a stance. And if the Senate doesn't want to, then come November, we have a constitutional right to replace leadership. And if they don't want to do it, then come 2 years later, we have another opportunity to replace leadership. So I, again, am humbled and honored to be a part of this panel on this day, because I realize that this is yet again another important matter and issue in which we must discuss. and we must share. Because in the midst of, yet again, of all of this, we still have the intersection of what I have said are two pandemics. We have COVID-19 that has been with us for a few months, but we have slavery, oppression, and racism that has been with us for over 400 years. So thank you so much for this time.
Thank you, Reverend Manning, so much for your words. Now we want to pass it over to Representative Pendarvis.
Thank you, Tisa. Congressman Clyburn, Congressman Cunningham, Reverend Manning, and Tisa, it's good to see some familiar faces on the call, and thank you for the opportunity to be present. I'll be very honest, we're at an inflection point in our country's history, and a lot of it is going to take us to really analyze and understand the significance of this moment that we're currently in. And a lot of what I've been doing really is thinking about that, the significance of this moment. You know, Reverend Manning, you'll appreciate this. I've been, talking and conversing with friends about what is God trying to tell us about this moment. And the global pandemic, we're in the systemic racism pandemic that we're currently in, and also the issues that we're seeing across the country that has forced us to stop, to listen, and to really analyze where we're at. And honestly, we have come to a point where the Band-Aid has come off of the ugly scabs of this country's history. And we're dealing with the neglect that we've given to so many important issues for years. And we're finally having to wrestle with those and address them in some meaningful way. We talk about gun violence. We talk about systemic and institutional racism. We talk about issues dealing with the neglect in so many of our underserved and neglected communities. We're talking about issues that have long plagued us, that we've long ignored. And sadly, we've waited until blood is shed and bodies are on the ground for us to really realize that we've got to be proactive. The significance of us doing this forum on this day at this time is not lost on me. The massacre that occurred with the assassination of 9 of our brothers and sisters at Mother Emanuel 5 years ago, and knowing that in the 5 years since, what have we done significantly to really address the root cause of those issues? What have we done to move our society forward to say we've learned from the sins of our past? And I would submit to you today that we've done little to none to do that. And it's an indictment against us as elected leaders. It's an indictment against our community, where there are good intention and well-doing people who want to see good, but unfortunately, that's been outweighed by this stagnation that we've seen, especially in the state of South Carolina, to move on important issues. And so it's my hope that during this forum, we have a real and honest conversation about the issues that are going on, that we come up with actionable items that we can take action on, and that we understand that we can do a lot going forward if we understand the significance of the moment. I don't want us to lose sight of what's in front of us. We will know so much about how we've been able to utilize this moment and to be able to harness the energy and the frustrations and the anger and the sentiments of so many people and say, we've learned, but now we're going to take action, whether it's legislative action, whether it's community action, and say we're going to do better. And so I'm looking forward for a fruitful discussion. It's a pleasure to be on here, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Representative Pendarvis. Just want to thank each and every one of you for your thoughtful comments. So right now we're going to open up the conversation for a few questions. I have a few questions for the panelists. Please drop it, if you have any questions for the panelists, please drop them in the chat box. While those are starting, I'll come up with a few of my initial questions to get started. The first question is for Whip Clyburn and Representative Cunningham. We are here on the 5-year mark of the shooting at a Mother Emanuel Church. Due to a prior conviction, the shooter should have never been able to purchase a gun. However, due to a loophole in federal law, that allows for gun sales to proceed if a background check is not completed in 3 business days. He was able to purchase a firearm. This loophole is now known as the Charleston Loophole. Last year, the House voted and passed Whip Clyburn's bill, H.R. 1112, which closed this loophole. However, in the year since, it has sat untouched on Senator McConnell's desk. What can we do as members of the Charleston community to demand that this life-saving bill is passed?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I'll start and hand it off to you, Joe. I think that Reverend Manning made it very clear. There are 2 United States senators from South Carolina who ought to take leadership on this and get word to Senator McConnell. I do believe that we've just seen the Senate introduce a bill today. Its answer to our bill, the House bill, Justice in Policing Act, means we're going to go to conference on some things. And I do believe that this bill will be eligible for conference because it's been acted on, and it deals not just with the Charleston loophole, but it also deals with the arrest, a contrast in arrest. If you look at Dylan Roof's arrest and contrast that with the arrest of who's that, Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta the other night, or the arrest of George Floyd, the contrast in their arrests, I think, will make the closing of the Charleston loophole eligible for to be included in a final piece of legislation when we conference these 2 bills. And I'll just mention to you, I watched it the other night, the arrest of Dylan Roof. Those 3 police officers who approached that automobile, once they approached the automobile, they put their guns back in the holster before they have opened the door to let them out. And when they let him out, they didn't slam him to the ground and handcuff him. He said he was thirsty, they gave him water to drink. He said he was hungry, and they took him to a Burger King. Did all of that before taking him down to police headquarters to interrogate him in a very civil manner. I saw a film of the interrogation as well. Contrast that to the treatment that George Floyd and Rayshard Brooks got. That, to me, is indicative of a difference in law enforcement. And so this is to close a loophole of a young man who had spent a lot of time on the internet, finding out all he could about white supremacy. And I don't know, he found out a whole lot about Emanuel AME Church and its history. He didn't select that church randomly. He did the research. So if he did that much research, I'm sure he researched the gun laws as well. He knew he was not eligible to get a gun, but if he knew to give wrong information, it could delay the background check. And that's what happened. The difference in Columbia and West Columbia. And so what the Senate is doing is holding up a piece of legislation that I think is just clear. Allow those, 4%, Joe? 4 to 6% of people will fall into this loophole. So let's close the loophole and then see what happens. It means that 95% of all the people who apply for a gun will be able to get it without any problem. It's only about 4 to 6% of the people who will be subjected to this additional scrutiny. And what we found out is that people who are subjected to this additional scrutiny, the chances are great that they should not get the gun. With that, I'll yield to you, Joe.
Yeah, I would echo with the Whip's comments. I mean, most people who apply for a background check it processes and gets approved automatically. Only a very small percentage of people actually go into this realm, which the bill closing the Charleston loophole seeks to contain. And this is a very common sense. I applaud the whip on it. It's very narrowly tailored to identify and remedy a specific issue in our background check system. And what this is trying to do is just keep firearms out of the hands of people who should not have firearms. People like the racist monster who entered Mother Emanuel 5 years ago. So the fact that the Senate has not picked this up is more than disappointing. And as to what other action can be done, I would ask everybody to contact Senator Scott and Senator Graham and ask that this bill be brought to the floor, and ask that a vote be taken on it, because this isn't this isn't a bill that seeks to take away anyone's firearms. To the contrary, this is a bill that seeks to keep our communities safer. And so it's just disappointing, to say the least, that this bill has not seen the light of day over there on the Senate floor. And I'm hopeful that we will still get it done one way or another, whether it be in conference or by bringing the bill to the floor. But we haven't given up on this fight yet, and we won't ever.
Okay, thank you for your answers. I have another question for the both of you. The disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black and Brown communities has brought into stark reality the inequities that these communities face that had been created due to the systemic racism in our country. But we know that the same is true of the public health crisis we are talking about today, gun violence. In fact, Black Americans are 10 times more likely than white Americans to die by gun homicide. What are some of the measures that Congress can take to address this deadly intersection of racism and guns?
You first this time, Joe.
Okay, yeah, I'll just start off by first of all, it's an excellent question, and gun violence is a public health issue, and so is racism. And I feel we need to have the CDC and other health experts conduct research and come up with proposals on how to effectively address gun violence as a public health and public safety priority. I can say that last year I was proud to see that Congress finally take action on this critical issue by investing $25 million towards gun violence prevention research. For about 22 years, that the Dickey Amendment has effectively frozen federal research into gun violence and prevented our nation from getting the information that we need to address this public health crisis. So I feel that it's long past time that we have an honest and fact-driven debate about keeping our communities safe, and that funding will be a critical part in that effort.
Well, just to follow up on that, I'm about to develop a piece. I just started on it last night on these two issues. Whether or not gun violence is a public health issue, and I think it is. And I also think that racism is a mental health issue. And I find it kind of interesting that every time we start talking about gun violence, one of the first things we hear from my friends in the Senate is some effort to deal with mental health, trying to indicate that it's not a problem with guns, these people are mentally ill, and that's what's causing a lot of this to happen. So I think that we are going to have a serious discussion about how we categorize these things. And most professionals are now saying that gun violence is one of this country's leading public health issues. And I think that the racism that we find in the system is in fact a mental health issue. The racist is crazy, and the people who are the victims of racism sometimes find themselves weakened by the institutionalization of the racism to the point that affects them mentally as well. Watching some of the people who have been interviewed after some of these horrific events in the last several days have made me to believe that some of these children and some of these relatives are never, ever going to get over the trauma that's being visited upon them because of these experiences. And that will mean that they are all going to be a part of our mental health institutions going forward. So I think that this is a good discussion to have, and I really believe that we are going to really do what we can to make this country come to grips with it.
Thank you both for your replies to that question. The next question is going to be for State Representative Pendarvis. Representative Pendarvis, we have heard a bit about what can be done to address this crisis on a federal level. What do you think is the best way for citizens and groups to impact change at the state legislature?
How much time do we have? Because I got a lot to say. But in all seriousness, I've been thinking about this a lot. And to be frank, I recently penned an op-ed in the Post and Courier talking about this very thing. And as I referenced in the outset, there's a lot of energy right now, and people are starting to understand the significance of the moment that we're in. And a lot of it is going to direct people into trying to push for the kind of change that we need to see, especially in relation to this phone call when it comes to gun violence. As a member of the House of Representatives of South Carolina, I've always been an advocate of engaging our elected officials and trying to ensure that we can push for the kind of reforms that we need to see. And so our list, I wrote down a few items that are currently issues that either one are sitting in committee in the House of Representatives and need to be addressed in the form of bills, but also things that probably need to be proposed that we need to be looking at when we go back in 2021. And so I'll start by saying there are three ways that I think people who feel impassioned and feel the significance of the moment that we're in, like myself, for them to get involved. One, we have to recognize that we have to engage in the political process. While it's not the end all be all, it's an invaluable first step for us addressing a lot of these issues that we see. And so that means, one, engaging at the voting booth, but also further making sure that we're engaging each other in the civic associations that we're part of, having conversations, elevating the conversations, speaking truth to power, and being very open and transparent about the issues that are around us. Two, I would suggest people who feel the move to act to really think about ways and legislation that needs to be implemented, and talk to your state house members or your state senators and figure out what they can do. For example, in South Carolina, we've got bills that have been filed that, deal with hate crime legislation. House Bill 3063 dealing with window gill yards bill. We've talked about, we've got legislation to ban assault rifles or to limit magazines. There are a number of bills deal with FOIA exceptions and body cam funding when we talk about police brutality. And so there are a number of pieces of legislation that have consistently been brought to the table. And I've only been in office for 3 years, but I've been there long enough to see that they continue to be ignored and they languish in committee for some time until they have to be reintroduced in the next session. And so people who are compelled, one, figure out issues that are important to some of the things that you want to address, whether it's gun violence, whether it's police brutality, whether it's systemic racism and trying to dismantle the institution that promote it. And think about some of the pieces of legislation that are currently sitting in the House or the Senate, or look at states that have done things that you think we need to be doing here in South Carolina and figure out how we need to do that. And talk to your General Assembly members and say, here's what we need to be pushing for. Here's how we can address these issues. And these are the bills that you need to be talking about, and making sure you're speaking truth to power and addressing it. And then continuing, thoroughly to engage our elected officials in conversation. So often we don't understand and we don't realize the power that we have as citizens and the strength that comes with being in numbers and really pushing your General Assembly members to move and to act. For example, I've been talking with a number of folks who we go back into session for 2 days next week to take up some issues dealing with COVID-19 and trying to address the funds there. But there are going to be conversations with, and I've been talking with groups who want to make it known that we need to be addressing, especially in the moment that we're in, some of these issues that we're dealing with as a state and as a nation. And we have an opportunity to do that. And we've continued to ignore legislation that cut it at its root and do something about it. And so there are a lot of ways people can be active. I only listed a few pieces of legislation. That's not an exhaustive list. The list goes on and on about what can be done. But we have to continue to engage one another and importantly, engage our elected officials and show up in numbers at these committee hearings at the state level and taking trips to Columbia when we're able to, once we're able to do it in a socially distanced manner. But being able to take these trips to Columbia and have conversation with our General Assembly members. Because I can tell you this, and I'll end with this. I've been there long enough to know, and I'm sure Congressman Clyburn and Cunningham can attest to this, that so much of the legislation that moves, especially in South Carolina, the ones that people talk about, the ones that get noise, the one that there's a movement behind, and we recognize that there has to be something done about it because we're accountable to the people that have put us in office, and they have demonstrated in a real way that they're watching us and they're holding us accountable. And so continue to hold us accountable, continue to take us to task, because that's the way we're going to really move and use this moment to get some concrete and constructive change.
Well, thank you, Representative Pendarvis. I appreciate your reply to that. And with that, we'll open up the questions. We've had a couple of questions that was put in the chat, and I'll go over those. The next question is for everyone, for all panelists. It says, how can we get community leaders to understand that Black Lives Matters is not a political statement, but rather a human rights statement? We need those who have been silent to speak up. And that's for whoever wants to engage with that first.
Yeah, let me take if I could, because pretty much, from a Black Lives Matter perspective, I've said before that it's not a political statement. It's nothing, it's not a politician, it's not a Republican, Democrat. It's meeting people at the basis of humanity, right? It's also governed and energized by the young people, which I've said before, that it is important not to get in their way. It's important to help them. It's important to sometimes guide them, but don't ever shadow their message, their energy. And that's something that I've even shared just a few minutes ago down at Marion Square. Their voices, your voices, deserve to be heard. They need to be heard. And when we align ourselves to support them, then great change and great things can happen. But we must understand that they're the ones marching. They have the energy. They also are the ones who are rallying more of a diverse group to speak truth to power, to take solid stands and to say, you know what, enough is enough. We want justice. We want it now. We don't want another public speech. We don't want a delay. We don't want you to get up here and tell me, have a kumbaya moment and then retreat back. But then we also want to make sure that we see you, which is also very important. So I think realistically, given the sheer dynamics of the Black Lives Matter movement, we must continue to encourage peaceful protests. I emphasize the word peaceful protests. It's important. There was an article that came out as far a couple weeks ago as why do we protest? We protest so that the narrative and the issues continue to be in public eye. So that way we can then introduce more positive changes. And as we are introducing those positive changes, then our communities become better. but it's not for any, in my opinion, as I share with young people, I'm not going to hijack your movement, but I will support you. I will have your back. And if you look behind and you say, you know, hey, Pastor, I need some help, we're there. Because that is how I characterize this moment and this time.
Okay. In the essence of time, I'm going to ask one more question for the group. What do you think it will take to implement stronger hate crime laws in South Carolina? Has there been legislation introduced before, and could this be the right time to reintroduce that legislation?
Well, I'll take that because that falls squarely in our lap. I won't say my lap, but our lap as a General Assembly. To answer to their question is yes. It's been introduced, and it's something that Representative Wendell Gilliard introduced right after the Walter Scott shooting in 2015, and he reintroduced it when we got to another session. And so if you recall my comments earlier, it's about how we've continued to ignore issues and legislation that's been put out to address a lot of these issues. And we seem to be reactive in a lot of ways and haven't been able to muster up the political courage as a state to take on this legislation and say, this is something we need, and this is something we should adopt. And sadly and tragically, we wait for more lives to be lost, more blood to be shed for us to think that there's the time to move. So to answer that person's question, yes, the time is now. The time is past due. It's been time for us to move on it. House Bill 3063 was reintroduced by Representative Wendell Gilliard this past session. It's sitting in the committee where it's been since he reintroduced it, and we haven't gotten as much of a hearing on the legislation. A lot of that is because SLED, the State Law Enforcement Division, and some of the law enforcement community feel like we've already got enough statutes on the books to address hate crimes. But I submit to them that we do not, and that hate crime covers a specific area that we have to be able to categorize in a statute that's going to bring these perpetrators to justice. And so we need to move it, and to the people who feel compelled to move and support that legislation, it's H3063. You can reach out to Representative Wendell Gilliard. You can write the chairman of the Judiciary Committee where it sits and ask that he move on that bill, and all the members of that committee, and ask that they move on that bill. And if you live in their district, if you're watching this, and in some particular state of this part of the state where your house member particularly is on this committee, you need to reach out to that person. You need to call them, you need to email them and let them know, why don't you support hate crime, and get them to ask that. We have to hold our elected leaders accountable. We've got to get something done. The time is now, it's past due, and we will be negligent if we look back years from now and think about what could have been done with this moment if we don't take advantage of it now.
Thank you, Representative Pendarvis. I appreciate that. At this time, that'll be our last question for the panel, but we want to give the panelists an opportunity to give some closing remarks. And we'll start with Whip Clyburn, please.
Well, once again, thank you all so much for allowing me to be a part of this. As many of you know, I started my professional career in Charleston as a public school teacher. There at C.A. Brown High School. My wife was a librarian over at Burke High School, and we still keep a home in Charleston. We appreciate that community so much. Morris Brown remains our church home. So thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this. And I want to say to the families and the friends of these 9 souls, we will never give up getting what we think would be the proper legacy for all 9 of them. And I do believe, sincerely believe, that something is going to come of the current efforts taking place on law enforcement, on restructuring our healthcare system, our educational system, getting broadband and community health centers into every community. I think that's going to happen. And I think it all started with the atmosphere that was created by the families, the friends, and the North Charleston and Charleston communities in their reaction to these two horrific events back 5 years ago. So thank you so much for all that you've done to help create this. And I hope that we can continue to prove ourselves worthy of the support you've given us over the years. And with that, I'll yield to you, Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Whip. The most emotional memory I have in my short time in Congress was when HR 1112 came to the floor for a vote. And the Whip remembers that, I talked about this yesterday, Senator Pinckney's widow and two beautiful daughters came to DC, and they had a press conference with us, and they were up in the gallery watching us in the House floor as we were voting on this bill. As the votes ticked up closer to the magic number of 212, which meant that it passed the House with bipartisan support, and the claps and the standing. And it was just a very emotional experience, because I knew that their family and the 8 other families deserve that and so much more. And I stand with the Whip in saying that we will continue fighting to get this done, but it's not good enough to close the loophole. It's not good enough to pass a law that would have prevented the person from obtaining a gun. We have to go deeper than that and pass laws and change society that would affect the reason behind the person wanted a gun in the first place. That racism that undermines so much of our society. As the Whip mentioned, it spills over into preventing efficient and effective healthcare for people of color, or access to internet, or access to quality education. But that systematic racism, it undercuts so many other opportunities. And we won't stop with just a bill to close the Charleston loophole. We'll continue to fix and attempt to fix every other portion that this racism infects in our country. We owe that to those 9 families and those many more families, and we owe it to our children and the future generations to come. It's an honor to be here with you all today. Reverend Manning, Representative Pendarvis, always a pleasure. Mr. Whip, thank you as always, and I yield back.
Yes, thank you so much, Representative Cunningham. Now we'll pass it over to Reverend Manning, please.
Well, again, I'm so humbled and honored to be able to participate, of course, in this discussion today with all of these wonderful, great leaders within our community. We are so thankful. And a couple of things that Congressman Clyburn did say. When we look at the contrast between how, I call it the downstream, not necessarily talking about the first responders, because the first responders responded with vigor and care the night of June 17th. But then when they came to Dylann Roof, there were no guns drawn. They did not yank him out of his car. They did not do anything that would have been different for a Black male. Guns would have been drawn, yelling would have been taking place, and before even the Black man would have gotten out of the car, he may have lost his life. There is a stark difference. That difference, of course, transcends into the narrative within our country that we are treated differently at times because of the color of our skin. And one of the things that we must remember with the lives that were taken early here at Mother Emanuel is that we must fight with every ounce of strength that we have, every breath in our body, to eradicate racism, to take a stand against gun violence, to make sure that those who go through trauma are understood, because there are several things that this community, our community, my community, continue to struggle with. And I would hope that we would be able to, as I've shared with others, begin to build on 3 T's. We begin to build on truth, which then gives us the ability to trust, which then gives us the ability to transform lives. If we do not have truth, we're not going to have trust. And if we don't have trust, we're never going to be able to transform. The transformation comes with the heart. And I would encourage all of those who are able to support the hate crime bill because it is important. There's no reason, once again, for us to have to sit here and have that discussion. Same thing with HR 1112. There's no reason for us to sit here and have a discussion. There are several great ideas that are in the House that are just sitting there. And we must make sure that, as everyone has already agreed to on this call, that we are engaged, that we are following, but then we are holding accountable to make sure that the actions, to make sure that the speeches are not just vain promises, are not just empty promises, but that they now become actionable and changing our communities. When we begin to do that, then I will be able to always understand that the lives of those who were lost here 5 years ago, those lives that were taken, let me say that, were taken 5 years ago, their living would never have been in vain, and their deaths certainly would not have been in vain. We must continue to stand and make sure that never again will we allow these type of atrocities to happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Manning. I appreciate that. Now we'll pass it on to State Representative Pendarvis.
Yes, and thank you again for the opportunity, Congressman Clyburn, Cunningham, Reverend Manning, Atisa. It's been a privilege and an honor. I'll end with this. You all probably heard me say throughout the call about understanding the significance of the moment that we're in. And I meant that. It's because we didn't get to this point overnight. This is a hundreds of years old problem that's going to take some time to unravel. But where we are requires us to really do some reflection and think about what role we play in trying to push for the kind of change, the transformation, as Reverend Manning talked about, that we need to see in our community, in our state, and in our world. I'm a big proponent of understanding your role of responsibility, and I believe we all have one. And the different spaces that God has called us to in our respective lives call us to think differently, to speak out, and to really push for the kind of reforms that's really going to get us on track and to where we need to be. We have an obligation for the lives that have been taken from us tragically to prevent that again, but also to understand that we have to move on and be proactive in trying to address these issues. We can't be so reactive, but we can't wait for more lives to be lost in order for us to understand. And so thank you again for the opportunity. As an elected official, I take it as a deep responsibility that I have to try to push for the kind of policy changes that we'll need. And as long as there's breath in my body and I'm in office, I'm going to continue to do just that. And with the help of my good friends on the call, I know that we'll be able to move the needle just a little bit and continue to improve this community. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Okay, again, thank you to our amazing panel for making the time today to do this. And thank you to you all for joining the town hall today. Each and every one of you have a great day, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was good.
It's good seeing you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're good. I got you.